All right, we're going to begin because this is this is a pretty dense section of the Pulling Together Foundations series. It's about colonization, the residential school system, truth and reconciliation, and the reserve system. There's some other things we're going to explore as well: colonization, treaties, laws and acts of parliament, residential school, and truth and reconciliation. So in activity 1, I've asked you to locate yourself. I've asked you to think about any experiences that you've had in being stereotyped or discriminated against. If yes, what were the short-term consequences and what were the long-term consequences? So I'm just going to share the consequences that I grew up with that I recognize. These are long-term consequences. I don't know if there's short-term. I haven't been able to wrap my head around that since I've read it. But I know that the long-term consequences are loss of connection to family, community, identity, culture, ceremony, traditions, languages. These are all long-term consequences of being stereotyped or discriminated against. Those were the ones that I grew up with. And those are the ones that I continue to see to this day, especially with our youth and urban youth, because they don't have that connection. Some of them, as babies grew up away from their traditional territories. And when that happens, there's this disconnect. And when there's a disconnect, there is a turmoil of emotions that happens. And a lot of it has to do with your identity and who you are in your community. I guess in the micro stage, it would be like your community, your family, and then macro would be the outward. So that would be the communities around that First Nations community. And growing up where I grew up, which is here in Windsor, but going home to Chippewa-the-Thames, there wasn't a lot of respect for the Indigenous peoples out that way. There was an unspoken understanding that we have to live next to each other, so we have to at least be civil, but there was never any kind of formal recognition about whose territory that those surrounding communities were on, like Mount Bridges, Strathroy, Delaware, Malvern. Those areas, they were racist. And then growing up on the reserve, there was a lot of racism surrounding my community. So I've also asked you to do a knowledge check. Who decides whether somebody is officially a status Indian? Just hang on to your answers because we're going to come back to these 2 questions at the end, and hopefully we'll have time to discuss them. I know the answers to these, but I'm not going to tell you. First Nations people still have laws and policies applied to them that are different from those applied to a non-First Nations people. Is this true or false? So hopefully after this presentation, I'll have shared some good knowledge with you, and we can talk about those answers. So what is colonization? Before the arrival of European explorers and traders, North America was occupied by Indigenous peoples living and thriving in their own distinct cultures, languages, and ways of knowing. Today, while many Indigenous people are successful in business, law, medicine, arts, and sports, Indigenous peoples are, as a group, at the negative end of every socioeconomic indicator. How did this happen? So in Canada, colonization occurred when a new group of people migrated to North America, took over, and began to control Indigenous peoples. So colonizers imposed their own cultural values, religions, and laws, and they made policies that weren't in favor of Indigenous people. They seized land and controlled access to resources and trade, and as a result, Indigenous people became reliant on colonizers. Today, many Indigenous people still struggle, but it is a testament of the strength of their ancestors that they are still here, and we're still fighting to right the wrongs of the past. Go forth, nor bend to greed of white man's hands. By right, by birth, we Indians own these lands. Emily Pauline Johnson. And she's a Mohawk English poet performer. And this is from A Cry from an Indian Wife. So the reason why I included this quote is because it's something that I grew up with. My grandma taught me that money is going to pay your bills, make sure you get fed. She always reminded me that I was Chippewa, that I was Ojibwe. And by doing so, in her own way, even though she's a residential school survivor, she ensured that by telling me things like this, that I would know that I have a history, that I have to learn, that I have to take interest in, and that I have to be responsible to, so that I can pass on what knowledge I have to the next 7 generations coming. So before the arrival, there was European explorers and traders, and there was this system that was in place that was working for both of them. However, with more European settlers coming, more land being taken and used, eventually the relationship began to break down. And it became more challenging for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. It became difficult for them to navigate this relationship as more European settlers came over. So colonization is the myth of terra nullius. Sorry if I didn't say that right. Changing names and rewriting history, competing worldviews, the colonizers and the Indigenous worldviews, justifying colonialism, and it's also the impact of diseases upon Indigenous nations. So the competing priorities and worldviews I thought were interesting because the role and the place of women in Indigenous societies, a lot of them were matriarchal. So women were held in the highest regard when it came to making decisions about their home, their community, education, health, economics. Women were consulted, and this was taken away by colonization. The ownership and use of land, because there was this belief of terra nullius, that because they didn't see people using the land when they came, they believed that nobody owned it. But even the concept of owning a piece of Mother Earth was foreign to Indigenous nations. So to hear that kind of language when you're talking about your mother and how you own her, it was hard for Indigenous nations to grasp that concept. There was no ownership of Mother Earth. There was no ownership of the land. It was for everybody. Who should govern and run the society? In European ways, the white male ran and governed society. When they came over here and they saw that that wasn't the case, they thought that because we Indigenous nations gave that respect to our women, that we were less than. Education and child rearing. I've shared before that my grandmother grew up learning how to be seen and not heard, but learning about my own people and how we raised our children, that's the opposite end of the spectrum for us. That was a complete 360 of what my ancestors grew up with, and then what I grew up with. So I didn't grow up with, children could watch adults, they could, do as adults did to certain limitations and whatnot, because that's how the child learned. I learned from Western society. I learned from elementary. I didn't learn from my grandma. I didn't learn from my kokum. I didn't learn from my mushum. I learned from a non-native teacher, and that's what my dad learned, and that's what my grandma learned. So the colonizer's worldview and the Indigenous worldview, as you can see, I put them in a graphic for you. The colonizer's worldview was pretty simple, right? It was white male, no women. It was for resources, and it was competitive. And then we look at the Indigenous worldview, and you can see how intricate that is, that infrastructure. In the center of the circle, that would be me. I would be in the center of the circle, and these would be, each section holds so many teachings, as you can see. There's at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 teachings in each section of the medicine wheel. And then within those teachings, there's more teachings. So it was a pretty intricate infrastructure of worldviews, whereas, compared to colonizer, it wasn't that intricate. It was pretty basic. So justifying colonization, the reasons why were Europeans thought they were superior. They considered Indigenous people to be other. Indigenous knowledge was not legitimate. So the way that we did things and the way that we taught them, it wasn't seen as valuable. Belief that they had right and moral obligation to make decisions for Indigenous peoples. We're still crowns of the ward to this day. We are still considered peoples that are unable to make decisions for ourselves and our nations and our communities. The impact of disease. This is pretty well disseminated knowledge story. But when they arrived, they brought smallpox and other diseases that were previously unknown. Indigenous nations had no immunity because they didn't have centuries of exposure to these diseases. So 90 to 95% of the Indigenous population died from these introduced diseases, which leads to a punishment from God. It wasn't a punishment from God, but that's how Christian missionaries got Indigenous people to switch over from their spiritual beliefs to religious beliefs. And, at the time, you have to think about what Indigenous people were seeing. So they saw non-Native people not getting sick, not as sick as their family or their neighboring nations. And so it kind of coincided with what Christian missionaries were telling them. Like, if you don't do this, if you don't believe in our God and you don't go to our church and you don't do what we say, you're going to get sick and die. So a lot of Indigenous people abandoned their traditional beliefs and converted to Christianity. The tools of colonization involved treaties, which I was surprised to see them there because I thought treaties, the way that I learned about them, I thought that they were just recent, like good things that happen. They weren't. Because of the way that they were written and the way they were presented, there was a lot of underhanded language that went on. So Indigenous nations didn't necessarily know what they were signing over. The European settlers never took the time to specifically learn any of the Indigenous languages so that they could procure a fair treaty. There's the laws and acts of Parliament, and then there's the reserve system, and then residential schools. These were all tools of colonization. The types of treaties. So, I've heard Russell Naughty say this, and I absolutely love it the first time I heard him say it. We're all treaty people, not just Indigenous people. Non-Native people are treaty people too, because it affects everybody. And ever since I heard him say that, it just kind of like a light went off. And it was a way for me to build on more allyship opportunities when I was able to recognize that treaties are for everybody, not just for Indigenous people. So there are many types of treaties. There was the historic treaties, and those are treaties that were signed by First Nations and British and Canadian governments between 1701 and 1923. There was the Peace and Friendship Treaties, the Douglas Treaties, the Numbered Treaties, and the modern treaties that we see today. So Chippewa Thames recently just settled one of the largest land claims in Ontario. Not just recently, sorry, it was about 5 or 6 years ago. It's called the Big Bear Creek land claim. I included a link at the end for you to explore if you would like to. So the Peace and Friendship Treaties were signed in the Maritimes in pre-Confederation Canada. They were intended to end hostilities and to encourage cooperation between the British and Mi'kmaq and Maliseet First Nations. Unlike other treaties signed in other parts of Canada, the Peace and Friendship Treaties did not involve First Nations surrendering rights to the land and resources that they had traditionally used and occupied. In modern times, the Supreme Court of Canada has confirmed that the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet First Nations continue to enjoy their treaty rights to hunt, fish, and gather. The Douglas Treaties, they were based off of James Douglas, who was the chief factor of the Hudson Bay Company in 1849. Over a period of 4 years, he made a series of 14 land purchases known today as the Douglas Treaties. These treaties applied to territories on Vancouver Island and covered small tracts of land around Victoria, Nanaimo, and Port Hardy. I've shared before that this resource comes out of, pulling together comes out of British Columbia. So some of their information in here, I've left in here. And some information, I'll try to make it specific to this territory. But I thought that that was interesting. I didn't know that. And I believe recently it was made official. I believe it was in the media that Vancouver Island or there's a part in Vancouver that was deemed Indigenous land. The numbered treaties. So the numbered treaties, I wanted to put these side by side for you so you could see the contrast in how intricate First Nations goals were compared to the Canadian government goals. So the Canadian government wasn't interested in any of what the First Nations were. They were just interested in money and more money. So extracting resources from the area, the Canadian Pacific Railway, and to further advance across the prairie regions in the name of colonization. Whereas First Nations goals were all about their people and their community, and then looking forward to the next 7 generations. And anything a nation does, a nation should always be looking forward to the next 7 generations. Because what we leave here now for the future generations is so that we can ensure their survival and that they're thriving. And I've included a picture of the numbered treaties just to give you an idea of how much of Canada is a treaty. The modern treaties, so when I think of modern treaty, this is what Big Bear Creek was called. It was a comprehensive land claim. So from 1927 to 1951, the Indian Act made it illegal to meet or raise funds for Indigenous rights and land claim issues, which is why you don't see it so much from that time period as compared to now. I've included links for you to explore. Current land claims can be found at this website. And if you want further information about comprehensive land claims, I've asked you to explore that link. You can share these links too if you want. So then we go into the laws and acts of Parliament. Now remember, these are all tools of colonization. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these woods and mountains were left to us by our ancestors. They are our inheritance, and we will part with them to none. And that's from Pontiac. He was the Odawa chief, French ally, and resistor of British occupation. The laws and acts of Parliament was the second tool of colonization to exert colonial power through those lawmaking and passing acts of Parliament. Prior to Canada becoming a country in 1867, many laws and acts were passed either in British Parliament or by the colonial governments in North America. In both cases, these laws and acts were made without consultation with the Indigenous peoples whom they affected. So there was no consultation that went on during this time period. There was just, we're doing this. It's for your own good. You're going to like it. Deal with it. Get over it. Move on. After 1867, the federal and provincial governments of Canada passed acts and laws that were designed to encourage settlement on Indigenous land and to assimilate Indigenous peoples, encouraging them or coercing them to abandon their culture, languages, and life ways to adopt a settler culture. We have the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It's an important legal document that was issued by George III in 1763. It formally ceded North America to Britain from France. And according to this proclamation, British colonists were forbidden to settle on Indigenous lands, and settler officials were forbidden to grant lands without royal approval. It's stated further that Indigenous lands could only be ceded to the Crown and that they could not be sold to the settlers. The Gradual Civilization Act of 1857. It was created with the purpose of terminating First Nations men Indian identity and enfranchising them to become British subjects. it assumed that First Nations men would willingly surrender their legal and ancestral identities for the privilege of becoming British. Individuals or entire bands could enfranchise. If a man did enfranchise, his wife and children were automatically enfranchised as well. This contributed to the marginalization of First Nations women. Under this act, men were entitled to a piece of the land not exceeding 50 acres out of the lands reserved or set up for the use of his tribe. This land and money would become their property, but by accepting it, they would give up all claim to any further share in the lands or monies then belonging to or reserved for the use of their tribe. So often the promises of enfranchisement were not honored, and the First Nations man would not receive what was promised. Enfranchisement was to remain an important aim of government after Canada came into existence in 1867. It could occur involuntarily if a First Nations man wanted to go to university, or if he wanted to enlist, or if he was of good moral character or spoke English. The Indian Act. So we're moving into the Indian Act now. Under Section 91, subsection 24 of the British North America Act of 1867, the federal government was given jurisdiction or control over Indians and lands reserved for Indian, providing exclusive authority over Indian affairs. You can read the complete Indian Act online if you wish to do so. So this leads to the most popular question: who is an Indian? Status and non-status. What does enfranchisement have to do with it? What does further discrimination against women have to do with it? Well, defining who is and who is not an Indian is challenging and complicated. Indians are the only group of people where the government of Canada decides who belongs and who does not. And here's a short video on enfranchisement.
Meet Sam. Sam has opinions on residency in Kahnawake, but is unsure of how things came to be the way they are today. Canada has a long history of assimilation policies that all have a similar goal: assimilate Indians into the greater Canadian body as citizens. Many First Nations don't want this because they are already their own nations. A major role of these policies is enfranchisement, which simply put is giving up Indian status and becoming a Canadian citizen. Prior to the Indian Act, enfranchisement was voluntary. However, after failing to convince First Nations, it was enforced in the Indian Act of 1876. So how did enfranchising work? If you wanted to obtain a university degree or become a professional, such as a doctor or lawyer, you were enfranchised. If you lived off reserve for a period of 5 years or more, you were enfranchised. If you were in the armed forces, you were automatically enfranchised. Wanted to take part in the Canadian electoral system? You were enfranchised. Women who married non-native men were enfranchised, as were their children. In a nutshell, if you were enfranchised, you were assimilated and not able to reside in your own First Nations territory. In 1985, Canada passed Bill C-31, reinstating enfranchised people with Indian status. Bill C-31 also allowed for bands to take control of their own membership. Now that Sam knows a bit more about the issues of residency, he can make a clearer decision when it comes time to discuss the matter. If you have more questions, visit kahnawake.com/residency.
So I have also included this link for you. It was a timeline to look at the impacts of the Indian Act. Given my limited scope of technological know-how, I'm not going to click that link. It's quite an extensive timeline as well. So if you have a chance to explore it, please do. There were amendments to the Indian Act, but I want to share this quote with you first. The problem is we as Indigenous peoples have not been dealt with fairly. And also the governments have not dealt with the Indigenous issues the way we would like them to have. So Elijah Harper was really important in the stoppage of the Meech Lake Accord. I know when I took a political science class there at the University of Windsor, they were talking about the Meech Lake Accord. They didn't talk about Elijah Harper. I had to actually bring him up myself because his role in the Meech Lake Accord was overlooked. So he sat there and he said, no, you're not going to come in and you're not going to extract anything. There was no consultation done with his people. And like I said, in that political science class, he wasn't even mentioned. But he's very much integral part of that story in stopping it. The amendments that have been made to the Indian Act since, I don't know if they'll shock you. They still shock me. We can gather in more than groups of 3. We're allowed to leave the reserve without a pass. This is since 1951. So before 1951, it was illegal to do these things. Hire a lawyer, own property, and practice our culture. So the owned property, you couldn't buy a house. I couldn't buy a house in Windsor before 1951. I wasn't allowed. And so reading this knowledge about the Indian Act and residential schools and truth and reconciliation, it just, the more I come to understand the systemic oppression and racism, the more I am just amazed by the resiliency of my people, because, we were, excuse my language, we were damned if we did and we were damned if we didn't. But there were many more harmful provisions that remained, including who's an Indian. The definition does not come from Indigenous nations, it comes from the federal government. The reserve system is still in place. Residential school policies, and an imposed system of government. As of 2017, all of these provisions still remain except residential schools. And the last residential school closed in 1996, which isn't that far away. So in 1985, there was Bill C-31. I barely remember this. I think I was 11 years old. So I remember some of my aunties talking about it, because my one auntie had married a non-Native man. So I think when I think of this and I hear my aunties talking, I'm pretty sure it would pertain to her and her situation. I was a child, so I wasn't allowed to stay in there and hear the whole conversation. But from the bits that I did hear, there was relief that she would get that she would get her status back, and that her kids would also have status. And that's what it was, right? To address gender discrimination in the Indian Act, to restore Indian status to my auntie who had lost it because she married a non-Native man, to allow First Nations to control their own membership as a step towards self-government. We're still working towards that. I know my community, Chippewa of the Thames, we're still working towards all of these. So the Indian Act today, it's still in force, and it's a major reason why the use of the offensive term Indian persists today. It is an act that stands alone, as there is no African Act, Asian Act, Muslim Act, Arabic Act, etc., etc. The reserve system, when Europeans arrived, they and First Nations people and Inuit came into conflict over who would control the lands and resources. Before colonizers arrived, we had use of all the land and the water all over Canada. Usually nations just stuck to their traditional territories. There was trading and some intertribal wars that happened, but for the most part, Indigenous nations recognize the land as being there to sustain them and their families and their communities. I've included this because I wanted you to see exactly how much of Canada that Indigenous people own. 0.2%. That's not a lot. And it kind of upsets me when I see that, because, when I think about where the pipelines are going and how those nations are, trying to protect their resources and their land and their community, I come back to the question, 0.2%. And you couldn't find anywhere else to put that pipeline. It just blows my mind. So the creation of reserves. Again, under the Indian Act, and if you read the Indian Act, you will get a base education of where all these issues come from. So the Canadian government defined the reserve as a land that had been set aside, not apart, but set aside by the government for the use and benefit of the Indian band. Reserve land is still classified as federal land, and First Nations do not have title to reserve land. Reserves were often created on less valuable land and sometimes located outside the traditional territory of a particular First Nation. The First Nation had lived traditionally by hunting and gathering in that particular rich area. The confinement, the move to a small, uninhabitable place was a very difficult transition. Allotted reserves were always small compared to the First Nations' traditional territory. Reserves in the 20th century, there was a rapid increase in poverty on reserves due to the imposed laws and policies. Canada laws made it illegal for First Nations people to use traditional means of resource distribution, limited their ability to hunt and fish. The amendment to the Indian Act in 1927 also made it illegal for them to challenge their situation in court. Many First Nations people living on reserves found that they could not sustain themselves or their families. However, leaving the reserve meant facing discrimination and assimilation in the cities and giving up their rights as status Indians. The reserve system. So it's important to know that we weren't consulted when reserves were created. However, if you want to look at the creation of a reserve, I suggest that you do a little bit of research about Caldwell First Nations. That was the only, I've never seen a reserve created. So when Caldwell was created, it was quite the journey, seeing them go through that process in the media, seeing the reaction of Leamington as they took back their traditional territory. We weren't compensated for the lands that were taken, so I think that's where treaties and land claims come in. Since their creation, reserves have been moved and reduced, and their resources have been taken, all without compensation for First Nations. And until as recently as 1958, people living on the reserve needed written permission from the Indian agent in order to leave the reserve for any reason. Again, this is not new information to me, but every time I see it, it just, I don't know. I think about my non-Native colleagues and how they grew up and what would happen if they had a French agent that was there to tell them when they could leave their house and if it was okay, and if they left their house without asking permission, that they would be thrown in jail. So today, First Nations people still live with the problems created by the reserve system. There is often not enough land for all members to have housing. Some services are provided only to people living on reserve. This is true. When I tried to get tutoring for my son, I was told that they couldn't help me because I didn't live on reserve, but I'm a member of that nation. So people living off reserve do not get the same services. Many reserves are very isolated and do not have basic services such as electricity or running water. As far as I can remember, growing up in the house that I grew up in, we had well water, and I was 11 years old. My grandma would send me out there to put a cap full of bleach in the well water. And I remember thinking as a child, what's this little cap full of bleach going to do? Because that's a great big well. I also had to bathe in that water, and it didn't smell quite right. So eventually our bathroom was unusable. Housing. So the house that my grandmother and I and my aunties and dad lived in, it was a 3-bedroom house, but it was missing some walls. So the walls were frames. And I just, you throw a sheet up there or a blanket or something, and that was your wall. Privacy, not so much, but that's okay. At least I had a roof over my head. That house that I grew up in it's been abandoned, and it's in a very derelict state now, but Even when I was a child, I thought it was uninhabitable. The basement would get flooded every spring and summer. Usually the water would come up to your midway to your calf or just above your ankle. So a lot of our things always were, we couldn't keep things because it would get ruined. Um, my reserve had electricity. The things that we didn't have were good roads, dirt roads a lot. We just got paved roads, like maybe within the last 24 years. Running water is still an issue. It's safe to drink the water on my reserve now, but it wasn't a couple of years ago. We had to get bottled water. Myself, I still don't trust it, but they say it's safe to drink. So, um, one of my role models, I don't agree with everything he says, but I agree with him on most of what he says. So I'm going to read a quote by him. For roughly 7 generations, nearly every Indigenous child in Canada was sent to a residential school. They were taken from their families, tribes, and communities and forced to live in those institutions of assimilation. The results, while unintended, have been devastating. We witnessed it first in the loss of Indigenous languages and traditional beliefs. We see it more tragically in the loss of parenting skills and, ironically, in unacceptably poor education results. We see the despair that results in runaway rates of suicide, family violence, substance abuse, high rates of incarceration, street gang influence, child and welfare apprehensions, homelessness, poverty, and family breakdowns. Yet, while the government achieved such unintended devastation, it failed in its intended result. Indians never assimilated. And that's from the Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair. So, one of the consequences of the Indian Act was the promotion of the residential schools. There's the creation of the residential schools, there's the experience itself, and then there's the continuing legacy of the residential school today. And I've included this quote from Duncan Campbell Scott. When you read things like these about your ancestors and your people, I'm sorry. When you read things like these about your people, it invokes such an emotion that a lot of, I know for myself, going through this, reclaiming my identity and my languages and my traditions, it makes me feel resilient. And while Duncan Campbell Scott, this is what he wanted to do, he wanted to get rid of the Indian problem. He thought that, protecting a class of people who can stand alone was ridiculous. And he wanted to go on until there was no Indians left in Canada. But he didn't succeed. They didn't succeed. We're still here. We're resilient. But the legacy of the residential school system is still with us today. And it's important that all people understand its history and legacy. Only when we understand the true history of Canada and its relationship with Indigenous peoples can reconciliation begin. We can create a Canada that is inclusive of Indigenous peoples and where Indigenous peoples are self-determining in a nation-to-nation relationship. I don't know how many of you have experienced the blanket exercise, but it invokes the same kind of emotion. When I do that exercise, when I facilitate that, it's a very emotional and it's a very spiritual thing. Day schools and residential schools were made mandatory for Indigenous children between the ages of 7 and 15. The government wanted to assimilate Indigenous peoples into the Canadian society, which meant they'd have to give up their languages, spiritual beliefs, and cultural practices. And being an intergenerational trauma survivor, I can speak to that. The languages, the spiritual beliefs, and the cultural practices. My identity was affected by residential school because I didn't know who I was or where I came from because my grandma didn't know. So the experience uh, for most Indigenous people, it was negative and life altering. I mean, I've shared before that my grandma, she was lonely, she was hungry, and maybe at the beginning she was scared, but the more time she spent in residential school, the more she learned how to be sneaky, how to lie, and how to steal, so that she could help her friends or other family members who were there with her. She never talked about it. I didn't even know she went to residential school um, until I was in my mid 20s, and even then, she didn't talk about it with me. But her experience is in this book, um, and in this book, you'll if you get a chance to read it, you'll see that the purpose of these schools wasn't to turn out lawyers, teachers, doctors, professionals. It was for manual labor. There was no expectations of any kid that went to any of these residential schools to come out of there and be anything other than somebody who worked on your farm or somebody who worked in your home. Uh, and a lot. I mean, I also want to make it clear too that because of the Indian Act and what was going on during my grandma's time, there was the Great Depression. So Indigenous families were trying to survive with all these things coming at them. So sometimes it became a choice. Sometimes it wasn't a choice. Sorry, because it was either send your kid to residential school. At least they might get fed. At least they have a roof over their head, and at least they're with other family members. But if they didn't do that, their child would starve, or they'd be taken away, maybe worse. So it was like it was a double-edged sword. There wasn't a whole lot of options like how there is today. So the continuing legacy of the residential school system brought us to a loss of confidence in culture. There were psychological effects. There were effects on communities. Growing up, I didn't know I was Ojibwe. I didn't know I was Chippewa. I didn't know until my grade 2 teacher let me know that I was different and asked me what band I was from and what tribe I was from. When I went home to ask my dad that, he got upset. I thought he was mad at me, but I think he was upset with the teacher. But seeing that reaction from him, as a child, I remember thinking, I'm not going to ask him anymore about who I am or where I come from or anything like that because it makes him mad. And it wasn't talked about in my family. So I didn't know that I was Ojibwe. I didn't know. And I didn't even know what that meant to be Ojibwe. So I think it was probably in my mid-20s when I started going to post-secondary that I started learning all this. And then my grandma started reclaiming her indigeneity. Closer to the end of her time here, she was reconnecting with a medicine man, and she was reconnecting with her ceremonies and her Anishinaabe background. I was happy to see that. I'm actually happy to think about it right now. So when people left residential school, some people left with some tools. So my grandma, she left with the work ethic. Work hard for what you want, save your money, and mind your own business, take care of your family, and you'll be all right. But other people who went to residential school weren't so lucky. And some of them those residential school survivors, they still suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. They have anxiety. There's certain smells, or there's certain rooms they won't go into because the rooms might be too small or too dark. The psychological effects, and the loss of confidence and the effect on communities. If you can picture a pond, and if I throw a rock in that pond and it ripples, that's how I see all of this. And the rippling is still going on to this day. So the official apology, I've included that link for you. It's quite long. And they gave me a quote. It's just Harper saying, he's sorry that the Canadian government realizes that they were wrong to forcibly remove children from their homes. They were wrong for taking the language and the culture away. They were wrong for, putting families in that position in the first place. I was in a women's studies class when he apologized, when they put it on the news, right? And as far as I know, I was the only Indigenous person in that class. And the professor that was teaching it, they knew that I was the only Indigenous person in that class. So after we got done watching his apology, she had posed the question to the class, like, what did you think about that? How did it make you feel? And I was sitting there and I just remember thinking to myself, like, I just thought it was bullshit. I thought what he was saying was empty, and I thought it was repetitive of what had been said before on some smaller scales. But when she had asked me specifically what I thought and what I felt, I shared that with her in the class. Now, I don't know if anybody was offended by that. They didn't say anything, so I'm assuming they weren't. But it was quite the experience to sit there and watch that with a class full of non-Native people. Just a little tidbit here for you. Don't do that. If you have Indigenous students in your class and they identify as such, don't call them out like that in your class unless they ask to be called on, because that creates a very uncomfortable dynamic. I was very uncomfortable after that happened, because I am not the authority on apologies and reparations. Healing. Many Indigenous families and communities have organized formally and informally to heal from residential school legacies. Many survivors are now elders. My grandma passed away about 8 years ago now. She was able to live to see that, but I don't think she believed it either. The Indian Residential School Survivors Society, included a link to them in the references, grew out of a committee of survivors in 1994. It has centers in BC cities, and I don't know if it has any here in Ontario. I was going to look it up, but I forgot to. Its many projects include providing crisis counseling, court support, workshops, conferences, information and referrals, and media announcements. The Society researches the history and effects of residential schools. The IRSSS also advocates for justice and healing in traditional and non-traditional ways. And this is a picture, this is a slide of my reserve in Mount Elgin Industrial School. The first picture is where it is geographically located. The second picture is what it looked like to my grandma when she went. This third picture at the top is the memorial that Chippewa of the Thames erected in honor of those residential school survivors. And then here you can see my grandma's name. She's about the 12th name down, Mildred Riley. And then just a little ways below her is my grandfather, Samuel Riley. So from the residential school and the Indian Act, there was the Truth and Reconciliation. And this was created to document the experiences of all survivors, families, and communities that were affected by residential schools. This includes First Nations, Inuit, and Métis former residential school students, their families and communities, the churches, and former school employees, government, and other Canadians. It is also to teach Canadians about what happened in residential schools. These are the two overarching goals of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The TRC had 94 calls to action after going through the Indian residential school survivors, all their sharing their stories and their experiences. And from that commission came the 94 calls to action. And in the 94 calls to actions, there are sections that have to specifically do with education. And in one of the sections, forgive me, I didn't write it down, but in one of the sections, it specifically states, calls upon the government to support Indigenous curriculum and pedagogy. So support Indigenous knowledge and have it disseminate throughout post-secondary. Here's a video, just to summarize. It's pretty straightforward. It's the stories from survivors and the effects of residential school on their culture, community, and families. I've shared some of my experience with you. I think you'll find that when you watch this, if you did watch it already too, that there's a lot of similarities between my grandma's experience and the voices in this mini documentary. Activity 2, tons of stuff you need to know. So this is a book. I've ordered it. I'm waiting for mine, and I can't wait to read it. I haven't seen it before. I haven't read it before, I mean, so I'm looking forward to it. I put the link there for you to explore and see if this is something that you would like to purchase as well. But no pressure. Please make sure you explore any Indigenous texts or anything like that at your convenience and leisure. So back to the knowledge check. And this is where I'm going to ask you to participate. So who decides whether someone is officially a status Indian? You can pop your answers into the chat if you want. And remember, there's over 60 of you, so it's okay if just 3 or 4 people do it. I don't expect you all to participate. That might leave us here all day. And so with that, so who decides whether someone is officially a status Indian? Is it the federal government, the Assembly of First Nations, or can anyone decide to be a status Indian? And then the second question, First Nations people still have laws, policies applied to them that are different from those applied to non-First Nations people. Is this true or false? Thank you for participating. You're right, it's true. Did your answers change from the beginning to now, or was this knowledge that you already knew? Yep, federal government. Yep, yep, very good, very good. Yeah, I did. Yep. I'm glad that it's sticking, everybody. I'm glad that you're learning. And if you already knew, right on. Here are the references. If you have any questions about anything that's in these PowerPoint presentations, feel free to just, ask or give me a shout. I don't mind answering. So the blanket exercise is a activity that was born out of the, I believe, the Catholic Church. And it is, what it does is it takes a group of people. It takes you, it's like a living timeline. So it's a living timeline through the loss, through the terra nullius, so through the doctrine of discovery, right? It talks about the loss of land. It talks about the impact of disease. It talks about the impact of residential school. And as you're going through this blanket exercise, your blanket is being taken away. So the blanket represents almost like Turtle Island. So it represents the earth, represents the land that the Indigenous people are on. And so as these things are happening, pieces of these blankets are taken away. And what you're left with is like maybe one person standing on a blanket, and the impact of that exercise upon not only myself, but the people who take it. I see the value in it. It is a very powerful exercise. It just opens your eyes to the reality of how all these things impacted Indigenous nations. You're also welcome, and I'm just appreciative of your patience with me as like I said before, as I go through this new technological world. Hopefully, the sessions will get better and we can have some deep and rich conversations in the future. But I am always open to discuss with you. You want to have a Teams meeting, just send me an invite and I will discuss what's on your mind. So is there any other questions? Any other comments?